Right friends, welcome back to main events of 22nd week. The important events. The Prime Minister visited Afghanistan to inaugurate the India supported Salma Dam, and now it is known as Afghan India Friendship Dam. Then Prime Minister also visited Qatar. Then attacks on African students. We are going to look at India and Africa in perspective in recent times. Then GDP growth for 2015-16 at 7.6%. We are going to critically examine various aspects pertaining to GDP growth. Then rigid financial guidelines for central public sector enterprises, and are they in the right spirit or not? We are going to discuss about this aspect. Cabinet clears payments bank, and India Post is going to establish a payments bank shortly. And let us look at the first and the foremost event. This is the Prime Minister's visit to Afghanistan. Prime Minister along with the President of Afghanistan, Dr. Ashraf Ghani, inaugurated Afghan India Friendship Dam. The previous name was Salma Dam. This is situated in Herat province of western Afghanistan, and the total cost of the project is rupees 1775 crores, entirely funded by India, and it was executed and implemented by WAPCOS Limited. This is under the Ministry of Water Resources, and it took more than 10 years for completion, but the difficult circumstances prevailing in this area are to be taken into consideration before commenting on the time period which it took for completion of this dam. Please look into this slide. This is the location of Salma Dam in Afghanistan. And if you look at the details about this Afghan India Friendship Dam, as I have already told you, it was known as Salma Dam, and it is on river Hari route in Herat province of Afghanistan, and it is situated around 165 kilometers east of Herat town, and it is a multi-purpose project, not only for generating power, that is the 42 megawatt of power, and at the same time 75,000 hectares of land is going to be irrigated, and water supply will be provided to some villages and towns. And the project was executed under the most difficult circumstances, and materials required were transported through Bandar Abbas port from India. You may ask, where is Bandar Abbas port? Bandar Abbas port is important port which is on the proposed route of international north-south transport corridor. This is in Iran, and materials required for it were transported from India to Bandar Abbas port in Iran, and subsequently through land route through Iran and Afghanistan. Please look into this slide. This is the location of Bandar Abbas port, and this is the location of Salma Dam, and by road the materials were transported from Bandar Abbas port to Salma Dam site. Under difficult circumstances, around 1500 Indian and Afghan engineers and other professionals were associated with this dam. And this is another prestigious project built by India in Afghanistan, and all of you are familiar with around 215 kilometers Jaranj-Delaram highway built by India. Please look into this slide. This is Jaranj-Delaram highway. Right friends, let us move on to the next issue, that is the Prime Minister visited Qatar. Now we are going to look at India, Qatar in perspective. The population of Qatar is around 25 lakhs, and please don't forget, around 6 lakh Indians are working in Qatar, and mostly in blue collar jobs. You may ask, what is meant by blue collar jobs? Blue collar jobs are basically low paid jobs, especially in construction sector, and some of the Indians are also working as housemaids in Qatar, and most of the Indian workers are working in construction sector of Qatar, because lot of construction activity is going on in Qatar in view of FIFA World Cup in 2022. Please don't forget, Qatar is going to host 2022 FIFA World Cup. And another important aspect about Qatar is the country is taking care of about 60% of India's LNG requirements. And another important aspect is Qatar is one of the important GCC countries. GCC countries, you may ask what is meant by GCC countries. GCC countries are Gulf Cooperation Council countries, and the GCC group is led by Saudi Arabia. Here 6 countries are there: Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Oman, then Kuwait and Bahrain. And basically they are Sunni dominated countries except Bahrain. Bahrain is ruled by Sunni ruler, but the majority population is Shias. And Qatar is one of the important GCC countries, and bilateral trade between India and Qatar is around $15 billion. As I have already told you, lot of construction activity is going on, and several Indian companies are engaged in construction as the country is hosting 2022 FIFA World Cup. And prior to this, the Prime Minister visited Saudi Arabia and UAE recently, and this is the third GCC country being visited by the Prime Minister of the country. And Emir of Qatar visited India in 2015. And here the biggest problem is labor sponsorship system kafala. You may ask what is meant by kafala. As I have already told you, most of the workers are working in blue collar jobs, and for the persons to get jobs in Qatar, somebody has to sponsor the employees, and normally the employer is the sponsorer. And the biggest disadvantage is once they go to this country, subsequently they will confiscate the passports, and at the same time they cannot switch the jobs, and most of the workers are reportedly living in miserable living conditions, and salaries were withheld for several months. And as I have already told you, passports were confiscated by the employers. So this is the fallout of a kafala system. So this labor sponsorship system by the sponsor in that country, which is popularly known as the kafala, is also in existence in several other Arab countries, and this is causing misery to the blue collar workers engaged in those countries, right? And if you look at the important events of the visit of the Prime Minister, India and Qatar signed 7 bilateral agreements or memorandum of understandings, and they include cooperation and mutual assistance in customs matters. Then one MOU was signed with regard to investment in National Investments and Infrastructure Fund, that is NIIF, which is going to be floated by the country with 40,000 crores of rupees. NIIF is going to be India's first sovereign wealth fund, please don't forget. And another agreement was signed between Financial Intelligence Unit of India and Qatar Financial Intelligence Unit. You may ask what is meant by Financial Intelligence Unit. Financial Intelligence Unit basically looks at money laundering, and there is a suspicion that a lot of money is going from India to places like Dubai and Arab countries and coming back to India, which is known as round tripping. Both the countries also agreed to share intelligence on terror financing and hawala transactions also. Under these circumstances, this agreement between financial intelligence units of both the countries will be useful to some extent to curb money laundering. And at the same time, the Prime Minister met Qatari business leaders at a round table in Doha, and the Prime Minister explained them about the business opportunities in India. And at the same time, Prime Minister also addressed blue collar workers at a medical camp in Doha. Right friends, let us hope the problems faced by the laborers because of a kafala system will be eased to some extent because of the Prime Minister's visit. And not only that, let us expect some investments from Qatar into our sovereign wealth fund NIIF, right? Let us move on to the next issue. The next issue is attacks on African students. In recent times, several attacks were reported across the country against African students, and recently a student from Congo was died. And let us look at India, Africa in perspective and what will happen if these type of attacks will continue. First and the foremost is India receives nearly 25,000 students from the continent every year. So it is very important, and the name for India in African countries is knowledge hub and technological hub. In Africa, India is termed as knowledge hub and technological hub, and if these types of incidences recur, what will happen? It will be causing irreparable damage to India's image, and it will act as a boon to other countries. And students may go to Singapore, Malaysia, UK and Australia, and not only that, if the incidents recur, it will be a serious setback to the carefully developed geostrategic relationship with the African countries. All of you are familiar with the India-Africa Forum Summits. Last year, the summit was held in Delhi, and we may not match with the economic might of China. China is investing heavily in African countries, but at least what we can do is we can look at the cultural influences of India on African countries, and forging geostrategic relationship is very important so as to counter the onslaught of China with billions of dollars. Another important aspect is India already extended credit lines worth $7 billion to Africa, and also invested $1.2 billion in over 100 institutes in Africa. And not only that, India has already built vocational centers in Ethiopia, Burundi and Rwanda. And there is a lot of increase in the bilateral trade. The bilateral trade between India and Africa grew 14 times in the last 10 years. And at present, it is around $70 billion. So, African countries cannot be ignored. And Indian entities, that means Indian firms, have already invested nearly $32 billion in projects in Africa. And at the same time, African support is most important when India is to get permanent membership of United Nations Security Council. And India is carefully nurturing and cultivating African countries to counterbalance the influence of China, and this type of incidents may vitiate the environment. So, maintaining cordial relationship with African countries is very much essential so as to counter the economic might of China on African countries. Right friends, let us move on to economy and banking. GDP growth for 2015-16 at 7.6%. And what is meant by GDP? GDP is the total value of goods and services produced within the geographical boundaries of the country. And when we compare GDP of 2014-15, we have grown by 7.6%. And don't forget, GDP figures are released by Central Statistics Office, which is under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and these figures are based on base year of 2011-12. So the base year is taken as 2011-12. That means the GDP is based on the constant prices of 2011-12. That means the GDP is calculated based on the constant prices of 2011-12, which is the base year. So that's why the figures of this 7.6% are called GDP on constant prices. Not only that, it is also called real GDP. Right, and GDP based on the constant prices of 2011-12 is at rupees 113.50 lakh crores. Right, and what are the positives, what are the negatives? Let us look at it in detail. positive aspects are manufacturing growth at 9.3%. Unfortunately, this is not supported by other macroeconomic data like IIP, like core industries growth. Then service sector has grown at 8.8%. There is no surprise in it because the prime mover in India is a services sector. As far as GDP is concerned, then private final consumption expenditure grew at 7.4%. That means the private consumption has grown by 7.4%. There is no surprise in it because substantial percentage of population in our country are very young. Then increase in government expenditure because private expenditure or private investment is not taking off. That's why government is increasing its spending. So these are the positives. If you look at negatives, unfortunate aspect is agriculture growth at 1.2% only. And please don't forget, more than 50% of the population are dependent on agriculture in our country, but agriculture has grown by only 1.2%. Then another important aspect is construction sector growth only at 3.9%. When there is a lot of demand for housing in urban areas, the growth of construction sector at 3.9% is not understandable and it is not satisfactory. Then private investments are not up to the mark. There are two reasons for it. Already the companies have created additional capacity and the capacity utilization by the companies is not up to the mark. Second thing is public sector banks are already in the red. Several loans have become gross NPAs. Under these circumstances, credit takeoff is not satisfactory and the debt equity ratio of several companies is very high. So under these circumstances, private investments are not taking off. That's why government is going for increasing government spending. Other important aspect, other negative aspect is the fall in exports. Exports have fallen in value terms in the year 2015-16 by 16%. Then gross fixed capital formation growth at 3.9% only. This gross fixed capital formation is basically the creation of assets, equipments which will be used for increasing GDP. That means which will facilitate increase in manufacturing and services, but the growth of gross fixed capital formation is at 3.9% only. So these are the negatives. And when you look at 7.6% GDP growth, please ponder over the following points. Private consumption has grown by 1,27,000 crores in 1 year and this is not supported by other macroeconomic data. So if you look at the GDP figures from different perspectives, that means if you look at GDP in a critical way, the private consumption has grown by 1,27,000 crores in 1 year, which is not supported by other macroeconomic data. And I would like to tell you, the GDP has got primarily 4 components. One is private consumption, second one is government expenditure, the third one is private investment, the fourth one is net exports. So these 4 are the components in GDP. And look at the second point, discrepancies in balance sheets have pushed the GDP to the extent of 1,40,000 crores of rupees. And this is a 4-fold increase in comparison to 2014-15. So if you do not take these discrepancies into account, the GDP figures may be somewhere around 6% or 5.5%. Then there is a fall of rupees 17,000 crores investment in comparison to last year. Then most of the public sector banks are in red. Just now I have told you, even the largest bank SBI is also struggling to come out of NPAs. Then another important aspect is delay in implementing job offers made by the companies. Then job losses in several companies including IT arm of L&T. So if you look at all these aspects, it gives impression whether our GDP is really growing at 7.6% or not. Right? So let us leave this discussion here and let us move on to the next important aspect, that is rigid financial guidelines for central public sector enterprises. You may ask, what is meant by central public sector enterprise? the enterprise where the government's shareholding is a minimum 51%. When the government's shareholding is a minimum 51%, it is known as central public sector enterprise, and the department which looks at not only the investment needs but also looks at the disinvestments in public sector enterprises is Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, or DIPAM. So, DIPAM primarily looks at disinvestment of public sector enterprises. And the strategic sale of CPSEs, you may ask what is meant by strategic sale. Strategic sale is selling the majority share of public sector enterprises. That means the government losing the management control is known as a strategic sale. So, the public sector enterprises for strategic sale will be identified and recommended by Niti Aayog. So, these two things please don't forget, and let us move on to the aspects government gave receipt guidelines for public sector enterprises. First one is all profit making public sector enterprises will be required to part with at least 30% of their net profits or 5% of net worth, whichever is higher, as annual dividend. What is meant by dividend? When you are the shareholder in some company, let us say you have taken shares in Reliance Industries. When Reliance Industries is into profits, it will declare a dividend. That means shareholders will get part of the profits, that is a dividend. So, here all profit making public sector enterprises will be required to part with at least 30% of their net profits or 5% of net worth. You may ask what is meant by net worth. Net worth is nothing but assets minus liabilities. And if I have property worth rupees 50 lakhs and I have debts of around 10 lakhs of rupees, please listen to carefully. If I have property worth rupees 50 lakhs, I have debt of rupees 10 lakh, then net worth is 50 minus 10, that is 40 lakhs of rupees is my net worth. Similarly, for companies, net worth is assets minus liabilities. So, here 30% of their net profits or 5% of net worth, whichever is higher, is to be paid as dividend. This is the condition stipulated by central government on central public sector enterprises. Second point, firms with net worth of rupees 2000 crore and cash balance of rupees 1000 crore have to initiate share buybacks. What is meant by share buyback? Buying the shares from the market. That means there may be some shares outstanding for sale in the market, and these shares are to be bought back. And what will happen because of shares buyback? Then because of shares buyback, there is less availability of shares in the market, and subsequently there is every possibility that the share price may increase. It may not take place always, and there are several other fundamentals to be looked at if you are looking at the price of share. But the government's insistence is firms with a certain net worth and certain cash balance have to initiate share buybacks. Then public sector enterprises are mandated to consider bonus issues if their reserves top 10 times of equity capital. The companies having 10 times of their equity capital as reserves have to give bonus shares. Then public sector enterprises have to ensure stock splits if their market price or book value exceeds 50 times face value. So, if the face value of share is rupees 10, if the market value or book value is rupees 500, then that share is to be split. You may ask, what is the advantage of splitting of the shares? Splitting of the shares may lead to more liquidity of the shares. So, retail investors may come and purchase the shares when the share value looks less. So, it will lead to liquidity as far as public sector enterprises are concerned. So, these 4 guidelines were given by the government to public sector enterprises. And Central government, by issuing these guidelines, hopes that these steps will boost investor confidence in public sector enterprises, which may result in good response to future share sales. Let us examine it critically. What is the need for this rule-based approach? Normally, private sector enterprises or public sector enterprises have to take decisions, and the decisions will depend on their individual return on investment or return on assets, and rule-based approach will drain public sector enterprises of desired autonomy of their boards. Where is autonomy for public sector enterprises boards when government is indicating all these stipulations on public sector enterprises? Then second point is one size fits all criteria with the minimum payouts from public sector enterprises is regressive in nature. That means individual investment needs of public sector enterprises may be different. What is the point in giving rule-based approach to all the public sector enterprises as a whole? Then private sector firms normally decide their dividend or buyback policies based on business conditions prevailing at that point of time. Not only on that, the decisions must be based on return on investment on new projects, and the public sector is also expected to function on these lines, and there is no point in stipulating guidelines uniformly across all public sector enterprises. Then fourth one is, it is not easy to say whether the bonus shares or stock splits will result in any sustainable boost to shareholder returns. And it is a top-down approach and against the tenets of the governance of public sector enterprises. And it would have been appreciable if the government has taken into consideration parameters like return on equity for each public sector enterprise separately. So there is no point in giving these type of instructions with the top-down approach. Right friends, let us leave this discussion at this juncture. Let us move on to the last point of the week. Cabinet clears Payments Bank proposal of India Post. Please don't forget, India Post has 1.54 lakh post offices, of which 1.39 lakh are in rural areas. That is the biggest advantage for India Post. And before going into this discussion, 2 points I would like to tell you. All Gramin Dak Sevaks in rural post offices will be given handheld devices by March 2017. That is 1 point. Then iPads and smartphones to postmen in urban areas are also being planned. And leaving these 2 points here, let us come back to the main discussion. Cabinet cleared proposal for establishment of a payments bank, and total capital will be rupees 800 crore, out of which 400 crore will be equity component and 400 crores will be given as a grant by the central government. So here center will own 100% equity. And as per the news reports, by September 2017, 650 branches will become operational and 5,000 ATMs will be established. In the country, already 22,000 post offices have core banking facility. And please don't forget, these payments banks or small finance banks are categorized as differential banks or NIC banks because they are intended to function on certain categories only. So payments banks will look at payments and remittances. So these are called differential banks or NIC banks, and they are different from universal banks like State Bank of India, ICICI Bank, because universal banks looks at all type of operations, whereas differential banks or NIC banks looks at only certain segment of operations. Right friends, with this let us conclude the lecture part of 22nd week, and please do join for other modules. Have a nice day. Thank you.